Everything that makes it successful is exactly what makes it dangerous. It's a feature, not a bug.
No, no. Okay, no. What are we going to do about it? What do you suggest we do about it?
You're going to make me say it, aren't you? Fine. We built a monster. We need to kill it.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of ERG PowerTalk. I'm your host, Joe Santana. That ominous clip that you just heard is from the HBO series called Silicon Valley. And in this episode, the fictional tech company Pied Piper has built this AI tool that can crack any code, from electrical grids to financial institution passwords to even the launch codes for every single nuclear weapon on the face of the earth. The company's leaders, they're in a panic because they want to fix this potentially dangerous problem, but they don't want to disable this tool because they see it as their company's greatest competitive achievement. At that point, it's when one of the iconic characters, Bertram Guilfoyle, who's played by Martin Starr, utters those scary words. Now, how does this link back to our discussion today on the topic of equity? Well, it seems that in many organizations today, leaders realize that their company systems actually don't work for everyone. Yet DEI efforts are always directed at making these existing systems work for everyone or making them more available through inclusion. These leaders often feel that these systems are really key elements to their secret success sauce. So they're afraid to change them. So instead, what they do is they opt to make them more equitable by making them more inclusive. But according to our guest today, many of these systems, they simply were not designed to work for everyone, most certainly not for the new, more diverse workforce that we have. Their lack of equity is a central feature. It's not a bug or something that we can get rid of through inclusion efforts alone. So in light of this, how do we bring equity to our companies? That's the focus of our discussion today with our guest. She is the author of Equity: How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives. And in addition to that, she's the founder of Brevity and Wit, a strategy and design firm that combines human-centered design, behavior change science, and the principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility to help organizations transform themselves.
Hi, I am Minal Bopaiah. I am the founder and principal consultant at Brevity and Wit, and also the author of Equity: How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives.
Minal, thank you so much for joining us today. And as you know from previous conversations and emails that I've sent you and just general discussions that we've had, you made a fan out of me. So it's really a pleasure having you here. I've actually been listening to other programs that you've done and gleaning some other information. And I've taken some of the stories that you shared with me in our initial meeting and shared it with others in my CDO Power Circle meetings and other groups. But for those of our listeners who don't know you and your work, can you start with a little bit of background?
My parents came in 1976 and they landed in the heart of New York City. And they had, I think, about $20 on them, one suitcase. My mother was pregnant with me, but they had lined up medical residencies at Greenpoint Hospital in Brooklyn. And this was during the height of the very racist war on crime, during a lot of financial mismanagement in New York City, where there was practically an atmosphere of civil war. And their first days in this country were rough. My father talks about how he saw more gunshot wounds in one night in the ER than he had seen in 4 years of surgical residency in England. My mother talks about how I think about half of the medical residents had been mugged by people living with addiction who had been forced out onto the streets instead of invited into the hospital for treatment. And nevertheless, they were able to leave Brooklyn for the greener suburbs of Staten Island. They were able to start a private practice, buy a home, buy an office building, provide for their extended family and their community. My father made New York Magazine's list of best doctor about 8 times, and by all sort of external trappings, live that proverbial American dream. But as I talk about in the book, that's not the full story. If we're really trying to see the system, we got to zoom out and see a couple of other factors that contributed to their success. First of all, the reason they were able to enter the country in 1976 was because of the Civil Rights Movement, and particularly the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. Before that act, the US had an explicit policy to grant visas and green cards in order to preserve the homogeneity of North America, meaning the white majority. So the system would not have let them in, no matter how smart or talented they were. However, even in that act of greater equity, there were certain inequities, and it was again exploited, in that the US immigration system began to take advantage of socialized education in other countries like India and China and Europe to fill the labor needs of this country. And so my parents, even though they came from really humble beginnings, were able to go to medical school for about, the family law is like $50 a semester. That's why they were able to become doctors, and that's why they were granted entry into this country, is because they had their medical degrees. And when Asians or Indians are held up as a model minority, it's a very disingenuous argument, because people of color in this country, particularly Black, Latino, and Indigenous populations, have not been granted the access to socialized education that many of the Asian immigrants have. Instead, we have an education system that is funded by property taxes. And so fundamentally, people are able to buy their children's education through their home mortgage. I believe that if we had socialized education, you would see just as many people who were born here with poor parents and dark skin become doctors as you do in the Indian diaspora. And so when we're talking about equity, we're talking about this ability to see how the system influences our opportunities and our life trajectories, and that the system itself is not fair and a meritocracy. Instead, it has been designed to advantage some people over others.
I remember when I first spoke to you and we were talking about this, that it made me reflect on certain things in my own life, all the way from my grandmother, mother, later on, my wife and myself. Little things that I didn't think about before that actually were contributory to my ability to do certain things that I've done that maybe somebody else may not have done because they were missing those components. So it's not just that one caste of people has these, although there is a caste of people that tend to have more of these privileges, but that all of us who do succeed often do so. Like Isaac Newton said that if he could see farther, it's because he stood on the shoulder of giants. And I think that a lot of us stand on a lot of different shoulders, but when we tell our story, it sounds like the individual struggle and how we made it because we just really pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps. And that tends to not be true. But when you talk about your own story, to me, it makes me reflect about mine. And I've actually shared it with others, and it gets them to reflect as well, which I think is something we're going to talk about a little more later on. But in your work, you focus on equity, obviously. And one of the things that you're quick to point out is that equity is often mistaken for the feeling of belonging or for being given access, but that's not what it is. So I think you alluded to it, but tell us exactly what equity is.
So equity is really about systems and processes and policies and procedures and things that make our head hurt. It is not the warm, fuzzy feelings of inclusion, which is why I think it gets short shrift, right? I think it's more of a thinker's concept, whereas inclusion is more of a feeler's concept, if you're thinking about the MBTI, right? And I like to define equity in comparison to equality because I think it helps to delineate between the two. Even though I think both are valuable, they just need to be used differentially. So equality is when everyone gets the same thing. Equity is when people get what they need to thrive and participate fully. Equity is not afraid of difference. It actually embraces difference and then leverages it for greater creativity and innovation and a greater sense of belonging for everyone.
I love that definition. So the challenges with equity clearly are not addressed by putting feel-good Band-Aids on our current system, right? So what are some of the ways that you find that inequity is best addressed and so that we can create equity in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex topic, and I think the book walks people through it. The prerequisites for addressing equity are that leaders need to value difference, they need to be able to see the system, and they need to be willing to use their power to create greater opportunity for others. the building blocks of equity and the building blocks of inequity, if we think about it, it's the same building blocks. It's power, money, and time. How do we use those three resources? Do we use our power to hold power over people and take more than we need? Or do we use it to enhance relationships and acknowledge interdependence and make sure that everybody gets what they need? Do we use money as a weapon, or, to paraphrase Edgar Villanueva, do we use money as medicine and allow it to connect and heal and repair our societies? And then time is an interesting one because we seem to have a very odd notion of time. Time is actually the most finite resource we have. No matter how rich and powerful you are, you cannot create or make more time. And a lot of jobs seem to not account for time management in that they are clearly not meant for a 40-hour work week. And so we need to get much more realistic about allocations and how we are using our time, and also how people are using money to buy time and then creating this false lie that they're doing all the work when they actually have a team of people around them. So those are the building blocks to start on it. And then we have to really be able to do a power analysis of our systems. And we need to be able to redesign our systems by centering people who have historically been pushed to the margins. And we need to be able to engage in empathy and perspective gathering and listening and being able to believe people when they tell us that their lived experience is different than anything we can imagine.
When you talked about the systems that are already in place and how we need to reimagine these systems or work with these systems, there's a great example that you gave me that I've been using with a lot of people. Some of the people that are listening to this may actually be familiar with this story that I've told again and again after my conversation with you. Could you share that with our listeners?
So I think I gave the example of understanding that the modern workplace was really designed in the 1950s, when it was designed for straight, white, able-bodied men, many of whom who had a wife at home who was picking up all the cognitive and emotional labor and childcare for free. And they lived in the suburbs. They were able to commute. They were able to go to job and then come home to a healthy home-cooked meal. One income was allowed to pay for a home mortgage, their kids' education, retirement, so on and so forth. That world does not exist for most people, including straight white men nowadays, right? Even straight white men know that world is not what's happening for most of them. And so we have to look at what are the business practices that came out of that time that really were built around that identity and not around any other sort of identity or lived experience. And so, for example, most businesses will allow a sales rep to write off travel and the expense of taking a client out for drinks. But if you were to put a single mother in that situation and ask her to be a sales rep, the most critical need she has in order to do her job is probably going to be childcare. And yet we can't write childcare off as a business expense, which is ridiculous because you don't need alcohol to close a deal, but you probably definitely need childcare to close a deal. And so we have created a system that has been designed for a certain type of individual and their lived experience and not for the rest of us.
That's a great story because I think it shows how this is something that's hidden. It's something that unless we actually look for it, we may just go right past it and accept it because that's the way it's been.
Or we react if somebody were I'm writing off my childcare as a business expense, there would be such a brouhaha in most organizations.
That's right.
Somebody tried to do that, right?
That's right.
It'd be what? That seems so radical to us because we have been so conditioned to accept what is by the system.
Absolutely. And wouldn't even blink if we see a vodka and tonic on the expense report, right?
Yeah.
And while you were talking about that and my own history that I remembered from my days before I came into the DEI space, I used to be the head of an organization that provided consulting and outsourcing. And I remember that one of the challenges that we seemed to have was getting more women into leadership positions. And so I started looking at that more carefully and trying to figure out, well, where is it that this fall off happens, that people go from one role into the other role, and then all of a sudden the men just keep ascending and the women don't seem to get past this barrier that's there, or something that's stopping them. And what I found was that the organization had a training program that very likely was developed the same way as you mentioned the reimbursement program was developed. It was developed at a time when most of the people that were coming into the organization were engineers. Either they were equipment engineers or they were software engineers. And in order to become good managers, they needed to learn more about the logistics of the organization, how the help desk ran, and how the administrative pieces of getting parts to repair equipment ran. Anyway, most of the men that were coming into the organization at the time that I was there were still coming in through that technical track. Most of the women were coming in through that more administrative track. And in order to become a manager of a group inside a client organization, you had to understand the whole picture. So we had a training program set up that actually helped people that were technical, mostly men, understand the other side of the equation, which was the administrative side. But we had no corresponding program for someone who came in through the help desk or logistics, which were the women mostly, to understand the technical side. So it became clear that giving access to women to the training program that was there to get them into that first step of management, it wasn't adequate. It wasn't what they needed, because they needed the flip side of the coin, and there was no program for that. Most likely because, as in the case of the reimbursements that you were talking about, they were mostly men, and what they needed was that other side of the coin. They didn't need to understand the technical. They came with that. So those are two different types of examples. But I think that anyone today who looks around their organization at the different systems can probably find a lot of those little hidden things in their organization that really advantage one group and disadvantage another group, because that other group wasn't even on the radar at the time that these rules were created. So you also shared in our previous discussions how a lot of these current systems are also defended as being fair by showing examples of people who made it through the system. It worked for them, and maybe showing even a little bit of diversity in who made it through the system and saying, well, look, this particular group made it, or this particular woman made it, or someone else. And that's used as a way of saying, obviously, it's not the system. The system can work for anyone. And you shared a little bit about yourself and your own story and your path to getting to where you are today that debunk that. Could you share that with our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, what we like to believe in the United States, and I think globally, is that like hard work equals success, that it is somehow a linear equation and a direct correlation. Now, it's not that hard work isn't important, but that's not the full equation. If we develop system sight, we start to see that it's hard work plus system support that equals success. And so the story that I often say is that I am a woman entrepreneur and an author, and I've had a really successful year, and I just published a book, and I can, easily talk about how hard I worked on both of those things. But if I'm really honest about it, I had the idea for Brevity and Wit 10 years ago. It didn't take off until 4 years ago because I got married and I was able to get on my husband's health insurance. And even though my husband, who's a firefighter and paramedic, is not rich by any means, having his income provided that little bit of a buffer that I needed of about 3 months to make the business profitable. When I was single, I could not manage that. And so my success is because I worked hard and because I was married. And during a pandemic, I was able to write a book because I'm child-free. I don't have any kids. I didn't have to homeschool anyone. For me to talk about how I worked hard in front of other women who are either not married or who have children that they have to caretake is doing harm. It is gaslighting them on the equation of success. And so it's really important that leaders start to unmask the system for everybody else, so that not because we're saying that like you shouldn't be working hard, but so that we can address the other part of this equation. How is the system supporting you? Because also, to be fair, whether I'm married or I have kids, it should not be correlated to my professional success. I did not become more intelligent. I did not start working harder. I did not become more creative the minute I got married. And I am none of those things because I chose to not have children. They are completely mutually exclusive of my intellectual and professional interests and pursuits. And so if that's a meritocracy, then my marital status and my parental status should have no bearing on my success. And yet that is not the case for most women.
You actually confront one of my little pet peeves, which is the whole concept of leaning in, that everything can be resolved just by leaning in. There is a component of leaning into things and working hard and developing the skill sets that you've developed. But then there are all these other systemic pieces that make it possible. And a lot of times when people have success stories and someone comes up like yourself and talks about their success, they tend to omit that, right? It's sort of like, well, I worked very hard and I was fortunate enough that I met this mentor and then this other thing happened. But what's left out is all those other shoulders that you had to climb on, to keep with our old analogy, in order to get there, that have to do with other components that have nothing to do with your capability or skill, but are just things that were needed in order to be able to compensate for the lacks in the system. There's another thing that you talk about, which I think is worth sharing with our listeners as well, which is about how any frontal attempt or bold attempt to change the system, to come back and say, you know what, this reimbursement system is unfair to a group of people, or this training system actually does not develop the best people into managers. It just develops those people that need these qualities because the system is designed this way. Those tend to find a lot of resistance very quickly from what some of my friends have called the root guards. And so inequity often continues, as you've said, because it's often invisible. So talk a little bit about that. How does inequity keep itself invisible?
So I do believe in being able to talk about the inequities. Like, I believe in those sorts of bold conversations, because I really like Margaret McFarland, who was a longtime collaborator of Fred Rogers, used to say, any human experience is mentionable and anything mentionable is manageable. So if we can't talk about it, then we can't manage it. However, when we're looking at solutions, the solutions need to be embedded in the system. Because most people don't notice the system, they don't understand what I mean by that. So let me explain. There was an experiment in Stockholm where they wanted to get more people to use the stairs instead of the escalator in the metro transit area. And so they created this thing called piano stairs, where it sounded like a piano and you could have your own like Tom Hanks style big experience walking up and down those stairs. And what they found is, for the first day, a lot of commuters use those stairs. But then eventually the novelty wore off and it got in people's way. And so they stopped using it. What behavioral science has found is that novelty is great for catalyzing a new behavior, but it is actually very poor for sustaining that new behavior. What you need to do is embed it into the system so that it becomes easier for people to do the thing you want them to do and harder for them to do the thing you don't want them to do. So for example, in Holland, when you get a driver's license, you are automatically opted in to be an organ donor. Now you can opt out, but you actually have to take the time to opt out. So they have much higher rates of organ donation. Similarly, in a lot of companies, you are automatically opted into retirement plans. And so how are we creating systems that automatically opt people into inclusive and equitable behaviors? And what I think I would talk to you earlier about was that President Biden wanted to address some of the economic disparities amongst farmers by allocating more funds for Black farmers. Now, that is tackling race head on. Now, and we should be able to have that conversation. However, when the solution is identifying people according to race, we run into trouble, because white supremacy is not that explicit in how it privileges white people. It doesn't say we're going to give advantages to white people. What it says is we're going to give advantages to people in the zip code. It's the school thing all over. It's like, oh, this area is safe. And then we've created a system in which white people tend to live in this area. So if the Biden administration had instead said that we are going to target farmers based on their zip code or some other metric, you could have hit areas that were largely managed by Black farmers without explicitly making race the criteria, because I believe that policy was fought in the courts and defeated, because we have laws that say that you can't target according to race. And that has been how white supremacy has been so sustained, is that it has always been a workaround. It has always been a proxy for race that they use. And so therefore, if we want to counter it, we also have to use proxies if we want our solutions to have legs.
That's a great example. I think another one that you have spoken about with me was also where extended or enhanced unemployment benefits were offered to people, but then they turned around, they said, well, they're going to do it by zip code using that same approach. And it just turns out that a lot of people that don't make a lot of money tend to live next to industrial areas. So if you're looking at the income of the zip code, then the zip code appears to be pretty well off. But when you look at, let's say, for example, more rural communities that don't have a lot of industry, the income or revenue in those areas seems to be lower. And it gives the impression that, well, that's a deserving area because it has low income. And it just became a way of giving more of these enhanced benefits to people who lived in these rural areas who were predominantly white, and less of those benefits to people who lived in areas where they were predominantly people of color, but they happened to be living next to these industrial areas that had a tremendous amount of revenue. So there's quite a lot of that. So one of the things I want to underline is that point that you just made about how important it is for DEI leaders who want to literally go directly at addressing inequity to look for ways to do it that do not look like they're targeting any particular group, and to use that same methodology, because that methodology can go both ways. So you can do it using the old zip code method or whatever other method works in the organization. So Minal, let's switch over a little bit and talk about the role that ERGs can play in driving equity. And one of the things that we've discussed, obviously, is by creating a little more visibility in terms of the privilege that people have had that enabled them to be successful. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked a lot about like the role ERGs can play, particularly when they're highlighting those sort of success stories of people from marginalized identities, that it's really important that it's not just an act of representation. Representation is important. It's important that you see people who look like you succeeding in the organization. But it does also have to get to this point of unmasking the system support that you receive to get where you are. Like unmasking the system for everybody, not just for people who look like you, but for everyone, is really important. And I think that's a role that ERGs can play in helping the organization develop system sight. That's really needed in organizations if they want to address equity. I don't think you can address equity without system sight. You know?
So let's say, for example, Minal, that I lead a women's group and I have a woman in the organization who's highly successful, who's going to come in and talk about her success in the organization. That's great to see that a woman is succeeding in the organization. But from what you're saying, what's really of even greater value is to delayer, like, what are the systems that made that possible that maybe another woman who's sitting in that audience doesn't have available.
Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. I'm just like, how much time did you spend on laundry each week? I don't think she did her laundry. How much time did you spend? Because really it gets down to this time equation. Sheryl Sandberg also only has 168 hours in a week like the rest of us. So how is she getting through laundry and house cleaning and car maintenance and picking up her kids from school and dropping them and going to doctor's visits? Like, how is she getting to all of those things before you talk to me about leaning in on your job? Because if you can't tell me how those things are getting addressed, then you haven't figured out the time equation for me. Your formula is not repeatable.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. That's a great point. And again, I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of people in organizations that are highly successful, women, one woman who was a CEO of a large business unit, but she literally would come right out, and following the example of what you said is the best way to do this. She would come right out and say, I am in this role because I happen to have a husband who's a stay-at-home dad, and he does do some other work and writing and so forth, but my career is the main career, and he literally is supporting me. We both decided that I was best suited to carry us forward financially because of skills, contacts, experiences. But for someone to say, well, all you got to do is really lean in and work hard, to somebody who doesn't have the stay-at-home dad or whatever other mechanisms they have, doesn't really help them.
Actually, 70% of the Fortune 500 CEOs have a spouse that does not work outside the home. You fundamentally cannot be a CEO unless somebody is picking up all of the labor at home. Especially if you have a family. So once you look at that, then the equation needs to be, how do we get everybody the support they need at home in order to do well at work?
Yeah.
And if you're not going to do it, then don't have ridiculous metrics for work. That's it. That's the equation right there.
Absolutely. Love that. So another thing that we talked about is how ERGs can design alternate systems or structures that are built around their community's needs, as opposed to the stuff that's already out there in the organization, which very likely was born in 1950 when the world was quite different. Talk a little bit about that.
So, for example, I saw somebody asking if there are ERGs for refugees, which I thought was a fascinating question, if there were any companies doing that. And I will say that as a daughter of immigrants, like second gen kids like myself, we don't have a network. More importantly, those of us who are Asian, our parents have so believed in this myth of meritocracy that we're told to just work hard. And in India, for example, in my parents' generation, you could get to medical school two ways. You could test highly and get in because of merit, or you could have parents who could pay and like bribe officials and get you in. And so the idea of leveraging your network to get ahead in your career is seen as very seedy amongst middle-class Indians, right? And so I was actually discouraged from networking or relationship building. I have mentored young Indian women who have asked me the same question, like, should I really be focusing on relationship building? Like, it seems like something that is a given for most Americans, both white and black, is actually questionable for like kids of Indians, immigrant parents. And so an ERG that is like meant for either refugee kids or second generation Americans would be able to listen to them on that, not even educate, because it shouldn't always be that you have to assimilate. But then also, like, how do you create opportunity for people who may not be as comfortable networking and glad handing, or because of their religion may not be going to events with alcohol, so on and so forth. So what they need is different than what other marginalized folks may need.
So again, we're talking about building another track or building another way to get there, as opposed to the idea of just giving people access to the existing track that's already there. As you were talking about that, I was recalling an interview I did a couple of years ago with a gentleman who runs a company called Standing Out. And one of the things that he did literally was work with people in the organization who had a variety of different backgrounds and provide them with the tools to understand how to work with the culture of the organization within the context of the United States, primarily because in many cases, people that come from other cultures are taught that certain things that are taken for granted in the United States, like, for example, networking, is a form of trying to use your relationships or glad handing or whatever. And it has a negative connotation to it. So when we talked about ERGs and DEI leaders and what they could come up with in terms of helping the organization to become more equitable, while avoiding the trap of appearing to be charging right at the sacred way of doing things. What are some examples of that you've seen in organizations where they've, in a stealthy way, worked some equity into the system without butting heads with that existing system's way of thinking?
Well, Joseph, I actually keep thinking of your example, which I think was great, about the mentorship for people who are leading ERGs and how you structured it. So I think you should share that story, because I think that's a perfect example.
Yeah. Well, I think that you turned the tables on me that time, Minal.
I did.
That's good.
I know when somebody has a better example than I do. So
Yeah, well, I think that one of the ways is to leverage the ERGs as a tool for mentorship and for development and for creating relationships and creating visibility. Because to your point, a lot of people that are inside the ERGs, for whatever reason, may not have access to the existing networks and to the existing pathways that are being used by other people in the organization. So you can create your own, and basically you create them under the auspices of this is something that you're doing for the members of your group, of your network. It's very easy to turn around and say, look, you know what? These people in this group are contributing to the organization's culture. Today, especially now with the recent pandemic and how these groups have stepped up to support the organization's connection with its various employees during this time of stress. These are people that are actually doing above and beyond their job. Someone else can turn around and say, well, I'm putting in 80 hours. Yeah, you're putting in 80 hours to do the job that you were hired to do. This person is putting in 80 hours to do the job they were hired to do. And then above and beyond that, they're doing all this other stuff as well. So that becomes a really good way of essentially, for lack of a better word, justifying why they're getting this extra mentoring or this extra training or this extra exposure or extra access to leaders in the organization.
So that is a way that you are able to center and support the experiences of people on the margins without saying that this is just for women or just for people of color, which would be discriminatory according to our laws.
Exactly. So, Minal, what are some final thoughts about what ERG leaders can do to drive more equity and not just inclusion into the existing system?
Equity comes down to power, money, and time. And I really think ERGs need to start pushing the idea that people need to be compensated for this work, whether it is officially making it part of their job and therefore taking other responsibilities off of their plate, or tying it to a bonus structure or giving a $10,000 raise for anybody who's leading an ERG or part of an ERG. It cannot be on the backs of marginalized folks to do all of this labor for free.
Absolutely. And I think that ties back to what we were just talking about in terms of the explanation for why is this group of people getting mentoring? Why are they, getting access to this? Because they are doing extra work. And I think that under that umbrella of compensation, whether it's compensation in money or compensation in kind, or in some other access or resource, there's a lot that can be done to bring in a lot more equity into the organizations. So, Minal, how can our listeners get a copy of your book as well as connect with you directly?
Sure. So the book is available wherever books are sold, including Amazon. We also have a website, theequitybook.com, where you can purchase it through your local independent bookstore, Barnes and Nobles, and you can also get a ton of resources. We have an equity toolkit. We have a Minal's bookshelf, which is all the other books that I recommend, and lots of other fun things there. And you can contact me through that site. You can sign up for our email list, or you can get me at brevityandwit.com. And just send me an email through there, and I'd be happy to connect. Oh, also, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I am the only Minal Bopaiah on the internet, so I'm very findable, and you can easily connect with me there.
That's great, Minal. Thank you again for joining us. And folks, I read Minal's book. It's a small book packed with a lot of information. So if you can go out there and get it right away, I think you'll get a lot of value out of it.